René Descartes famously postulated, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. For him, and much of Western philosophy, this equation proved the reality of one's own mind, and it served as a certain foundation for knowledge. For Descartes, it was a pure equation, free from assumption. However, later philosophers pointed out that even the basic expression, I think, therefore I am, assumes the existence of the I, thus demonstrating it is impossible to think without assumptions. In Lecture 2, I said the biblical theologian works to mitigate the influence of his or her theology while listening to the biblical text, while listening to the conversation. However, there are assumptions we inevitably bring to the text. Some will argue they're nothing more than theological interference. I think they're legitimate presuppositions that are no more and less difficult to prove than the opposing presuppositions. The 5 assumptions I will bring to the text are, number 1, belief in divine inspiration does not necessarily undermine the legitimate historical inquiry into the text. Number 2, presupposing the unity of the biblical message has heuristic value in the study of the Bible. Number 3, the final form, that is the canonical form of the text, is the object of the biblical theologian's study. Number 4, the semantic context of the New Testament is primarily influenced by the Old Testament and only to a lesser degree by Second Temple religious and social ideas. And number 5, biblical revelation is progressive and it's clustered. Now, let's take a moment and think about these 5 issues. First of all, belief in divine inspiration does not necessarily undermine the legitimate historical inquiry into the text. One of the seminal lectures in the history of biblical theology was J.P. Gabler's inaugural address at the University of Altdorf in 1787. He called in that address for a clean break between systematic or confessional theology and biblical theology. He believed that biblical theology could and should provide the material for systematic theology, but he believed biblical theology must operate independently of systematic theology. Gabler argued that biblical theology should be a historical discipline detached from the belief systems of those who pursued it. In his address, he outlined an approach to historical inquiry that presupposes a fragmentary and naturalistic view of the Bible. Gabler argued that inspiration is to be left out of the picture. He said inspiration was an obscure teaching of the apostles, and since it was not a teaching of Jesus, it should not be allowed to influence exegetical observations in the text. His entire position is based on a naturalistic assumption about the Bible. In the end, the assumption that the scriptures are inspired is no more provable than the assumption that they're not inspired. Now, I've given you in the video transcript of this lecture, I've given you the quotes from Gabler if you'd like to go look those up. So the theory that belief in inspiration would in some way compromise legitimate historical inquiry has yet to be proven. There's no reason why you cannot believe that the Bible is a divine book and at the same time have integrity in your pursuit of the historical understanding of the text. The second presupposition is equally important. Presupposing the unity of the Bible has heuristic value in the study of the Bible. Now, with the dawning of the Enlightenment and the scientific approach to the Bible, the authenticity of Bible books and the unity of the entire Bible was no longer a given. Enlightenment scholars viewed the Bible as a historical artifact to be studied like any other book of antiquity. Since the Bible was not inspired, so they said, there was no reason to expect that it would have internal unity or a single theological message. This assumption was catastrophic because it robbed the Bible student of an important, essential question. How does the message of this passage fit into the message of the Bible as a whole? The heuristic value of that question is incalculable. It can lead to great discovery. But from a naturalistic perspective, it's an illegitimate question, a nonsensical question, since it's assumed there is no single message in the Bible. Now, at times, the pre-Enlightenment approach to the Scriptures placed so much emphasis upon the unity of the Bible, it discounted the very real diversity that exists within the New Testament and the Bible as a whole. Differences were ignored, equalized, or explained away. As a result, two things took place. First, it encouraged eisegesis, the practice of reading things into the Bible that are not there. People were spiritually afraid of the diversity and the apparent contradiction in the Bible, so they approached the text with a willingness to bend it around their pre-existing beliefs. Of course, this all but deafened the modern reader to the actual conversation in the text itself. Secondly, it weakened the church's understanding of inspiration. The biblical doctrine of inspiration affirms diversity. That is, the texts reflect the personalities, perspectives, and culture of the writer, as well as the circumstances of the original reader. Any attempt to weed out that diversity is an attack on the inspiration and the authority of the Bible. To reduce this chorus of voices to a singular sound is to rob the Bible of its richness, a richness breathed into the text by God. So, in between these two extremes of denying diversity and totally denying unity is the middle ground conservative evangelicals need to champion. It's a belief in the belief in biblical inspiration leads one to expect that the New Testament has a singular message and theology. But it also leads one to expect that this theology is not a black and white picture. It's a rich canvas painted with a full palette of colors, each hue and each shade reflecting the uniqueness of the various authors God used to produce an inspired book. What is needed is integrity and courage. Integrity to let the Bible speak for itself, and courage to listen even if the conversation challenges preconceived beliefs and ideas. I think Childs gets the diversity aspect when he says, this discipline, that is biblical theology, has as its fundamental goal to understand the various voices within the whole Christian Bible, New and Old Testament alike, as a witness to the one Lord Jesus Christ. Clearly, he recognizes the diversity within the Scriptures. However, at least for him, these diverse voices all have one center, their witness to the one Lord Jesus Christ. Some want to jettison any consideration of a theological center because of the Bible's diversity. Childs selected a center that was broad enough to allow for diversity. Whether or not one agrees with him on his selection of the center of the Bible, his approach is wise. Now, the entire debate over the unity of the Bible, and Hassel says this is the greatest debate really in New Testament biblical theology or biblical theology as a whole. The entire debate over the unity of the Bible and even the unity of the New Testament is prone to extremes on both sides. To deny diversity is naive. To deny unity is antagonistic. I think Kostenberger sums it up when he says this: the one God, Jesus Christ, the gospel, these are the major pillars of New Testament theology. It remains the task of the interpreter to exegete individual passages in the respective New Testament writings and to relate the diverse motifs of the different New Testament documents to each other. Yet this may take place in the confidence that the New Testament is not a disparate collection of ill-fitting parts, which together result in nothing more than a cacophony of voices, but it is a well-composed symphony in which different elements form a harmonious work that echoes into all the world to the glory of God and for the edification of those individuals who respond to the divine revelation in faith. The third presupposition we want to think about, it's an issue really in New Testament biblical theology, is that the final form or the canonical form of the text is the object of the biblical theologian's study. Now this is important because biblical theologians like von Rott and Coleman seek to build their theology on a theoretical version of the development or the history of the text. All such approaches are profoundly speculative because there's no objective evidence as to how a particular book was pieced together. There's just theories about and criteria about how that might have happened. So it's all highly subjective, neither proven nor are these criteria universally accepted. As a matter of fact, the authenticity of the original text aligns with a biblical view of inspiration, but it's also a practical necessity for doing biblical theology. Some may reject a commitment to the final form of the text as an evangelical theological invasion into the text, but that's not necessarily the case. Even Childs, who does not reject the historical-critical approach to the text, argues that what matters is the final form of the text. He says this: the theological function of canon lies in its affirmation of the authoritative norm which lies in the literature itself, as it has been treasured, transmitted, and transformed. Of course, in constant relation to its object to which it bears witness, and not objectively reconstructed states of the process. So Childs is saying that these ideas of marking out the stages of the development of the text and then making theological assumptions about these various stages is not the point of biblical theology. We need to work with the text as a whole and identify the message in the final form of the text as it appears in the canon. Fourth issue or presupposition: the semantic context of the New Testament is primarily influenced by the Old Testament and only to a lesser degree by Second Temple religious and social ideas. So here we're thinking about the fact that the semantic field, that which gives meaning to the words in the New Testament, is primarily the Old Testament. And this is a highly debated issue. There are many that would want to totally understand the meaning of words in the New Testament, the meaning of ideas and concepts in the New Testament as having their antecedent within Second Temple Judaism or within the Greco-Roman world of the Mediterranean world of that time. I'm arguing that the Bible itself, the Old Testament especially, provides the semantic field for the New Testament. An example of this would be a very common one in Ephesians 6, where you have the whole armor of God. And how many times have you heard preachers use the idea of Roman armaments, the Roman shield and the Roman helmet, to illustrate Ephesians 6, 14 and following, which is so counterproductive, since the entire armor is really just a reference to Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 52. That's the semantic field for understanding the armament of God. And when you go back to Isaiah, you realize that what Ephesians is saying is put on Christ. The armament has strong Christological implications, strong messianic implications in Isaiah. And those are totally lost when you interpret that passage in light of a semantic field in the Greco-Roman world. So I'm arguing that our primary, I'm not saying that the Second Temple era did not have an influence on theological thought in the New Testament, but I'm saying primarily we must start with the Old Testament. The final issue or presupposition that I want to think about with you is biblical revelation is progressive and clustered. Now, Ladd once again reminds us of the nature of biblical revelation when he says this: biblical theology is neither the story of a man's search for God, nor is it a description of a history of religious experience. Biblical theology is theology. It is primarily a story about God and his concern for men. It exists only because of the divine initiative realizing itself in a series of divine acts, revelatory acts, whose objective is human redemption. Biblical theology, therefore, is not exclusively or even primarily a system of abstract theological truths. It is basically the description and interpretation of the divine activity within the sphere of human history that seeks man's redemption. That's a great explanation of biblical theology. Now, because God's activity occurs in the sphere of human history, we can see in retrospect that it was progressive. God did not reveal everything at once. His revelation was developmental both in terms of its substance and in terms of its object. The revelation itself would contain ever-widening concentric circles of thought, growing but never contradicting. The object of this revelation, human understanding, would likewise develop and be placed under new responsibilities with each advance in divine revelation. Now, throughout the biblical era, revelation occurred routinely but not constantly. In the flow of routine revelation, there were times when clusters of new information were given. Those clusters advanced the human understanding and changed human responsibility. I illustrate the idea like this. The main clusters in which there was a development of new ideas and a placing of new responsibility on the shoulders of men were given Adam pre-fall, obviously, responsibility, don't eat from the tree in the center of the garden, fulfill the divine mandate to reproduce and to bear dominion over the earth. All of that was responsibility given in tandem with information about God and humanity. And then post-fall, there was new information given about God, how God would deal with his fallen creatures, the promise that he gave that there would be a deliverer that would come and crush the head of the seed of the serpent. And so with promise and new responsibilities, there was also revelation to support that. And of course, these different clusters occurred. Noah was given new responsibilities as God gave new promise and new information to him. Same thing would be true of Abraham and Moses, and then ultimately through Christ and the apostles. A great advance in revelation. Now, what this more clustered approach to progressive revelation helps us see is that revelation was not a continuously increasing line. It was rather, there may have been routine revelation, and not all revelation brought new information, but there were times when there was a burst or a cluster of new revelation about God's plan and human responsibility to that plan. Recognizing these clusters does a lot to help us understand changes that occur and understand what's going on, especially in the New Testament, where you really have, at one point, a cluster of revelation that is given, and that came primarily through the apostles. This becomes really strategic. Everything Jesus taught was simply a consummation of what the prophets taught, a final realization of what the prophets taught. That's why he said, I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And indeed, he did fulfill it. He was the prophet that would come, that Deuteronomy 18 talks about. But then, in the book of Acts, a mystery is revealed. Paul talks about that which in other ages was not made known to the sons of men, as it is now revealed to his holy apostles and prophets in the gospel. So a cluster of revelation came through the apostles that changed things, obviously. That's something that is inescapable, a realization that's inescapable in the New Testament. We'll look at that in greater detail. But this clustered approach to progressive revelation, I think, is helpful as we deal with the data in the text. And it's self-evident to me within the text. And we'll see that, especially as we get into the New Testament. Now, I just want to make a few points about progressive revelation then, as we go on here. First of all, and I've mentioned some of this, progressive revelation is not a progressive unfolding of God's way of salvation. The way of salvation has never been subject to progressive revelation. From the earliest times, God clearly revealed that salvation was by grace through faith in his promise. The details regarding how God would accomplish this were filled in over time. Not all revelation is progressive. Not all revelation brought a progress or change in God's will for his people and their obligations to him. Once God has established his expectations for his people, prophetic revelation often continued, but the focus of this revelation was on the application and explanation, drawing out the implications of the revelation already given in this stewardship-changing cluster of revelation. So, in summary, God's progressive revelation came in clusters or bursts. When there was a burst or a cluster of revelation, human responsibility changed as a result of some newly revealed obligation or promise set. These clusters are clearly recognizable in Scripture, and they serve as the demarcation points ushering in a new level of responsibility in humanity's relationship to God. So these 5 areas, issues, or presuppositions are really important in the overarching study of New Testament biblical theology. And we will come back to them time and again, and hopefully you will see the legitimacy of them as presuppositions. You will definitely see that they are issues that keep coming up and coming up in the study of New Testament biblical theology. Thank you.